Imagine holding a pair of twos in a high-stakes poker game, but through sheer force of will, psychological manipulation, and a mountain of fake chips, you convince a paranoid, heavily armed opponent across the table that you are sitting on a royal flush. That is exactly what the Allied forces did in the spring of 1944. Welcome back to the channel. If you appreciate deep-dive, uncompromising military analysis that strips away the Hollywood myths and gets down to the tactical and logistical bedrock of warfare, hit that subscribe button, ring the bell, and let us get to work. Today, we are opening the classified files on Operation Overlord, but we are not starting on the bloody sands of Omaha Beach. We are starting in the shadows, in the realm of operational deception, radio spoofing, and phantom armies. We are looking at the greatest magic trick ever pulled in the history of human conflict. To understand the sheer audacity of the Allied deception plan, known broadly as Operation Bodyguard and specifically as Operation Fortitude, we have to rewind the clock and look at the strategic nightmare facing both sides in late 1943. The English Channel is not just a body of water, it is a moat, 21 miles wide at its narrowest point, characterized by vicious currents, unpredictable weather, and tides that can swing up to 25 feet. Historically, amphibious operations of this scale are a recipe for absolute disaster. You only have to look back to the British catastrophe at Gallipoli in 1915, where poor planning and rigid enemy defences turned a beachhead into a slaughterhouse, or even further back to the Spanish Armada in 1588, where logistics over hostile waters destroyed an empire's fleet. The grim arithmetic of war dictates that an amphibious assault force is at its absolute most vulnerable when transitioning from the water to the land. You have no heavy armor, no established supply lines, and nowhere to retreat. Adolf Hitler knew this. By November 1943, he issued Führer Directive 51, explicitly acknowledging that while the Eastern Front was bleeding the Wehrmacht dry, a successful Allied landing in the West would be a fatal blow to the Third Reich. He ordered a massive reinforcement of the Atlantic Wall, a staggering defensive network stretching nearly 2,000 miles from the coast of Norway down to the Spanish border. But a wall is only as good as the men guarding it and the concrete poured into it. How do you defend 2,000 miles of coastline against an enemy who controls the sea and the sky? You cannot. The Germans had to guess where the hammer would fall. Geography dictated two logical choices for the Allies. The first was the Pas de Calais. It is the shortest route across the Channel, a mere 21 miles from Dover. It offered the most direct route into the industrial heartland of Germany, the Ruhr Valley. The terrain was flat, perfect for rapid armoured exploitation. The second option was Normandy. It had wider beaches, a major port at Cherbourg to the west, but it was further away, and the terrain behind the beaches was a nightmare of ancient hedgerows known as the bocage. The German High Command, the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, looked at the map through the lens of traditional Prussian military logic. They concluded the Allies, led by the pragmatic Americans and the cautious British, would take the shortest route, secure a major port immediately, and drive straight for Berlin. They bet everything on the Pas de Calais. Let us look at the force comparison, because the industrial and doctrinal clash here is fascinating. By early 1944, the United States had transformed into the arsenal of democracy, a logistical juggernaut, the likes of which the world had never seen. Operation Bolero, the build-up of forces in Britain, saw over 1.5 million American soldiers cross the Atlantic. They brought with them an ocean of steel. We are talking about millions of tons of supplies, 16 million tons of ammunition, and thousands of armored vehicles. The American industrial base was churning out the M4 Sherman tank. Now, the Sherman often gets a bad reputation when compared head-to-head with German heavy armor. But from a strategic standpoint, it was a masterpiece of logistical engineering. Weighing in at 33 tons, it was light enough to be lifted by standard dockside cranes, narrow enough to fit on Bailey bridges, and its Ford GAA V8 engine was highly reliable. More importantly, we could build thousands of them. Ford's Willow Run plant alone was producing a B-24 Liberator heavy bomber every 63 minutes. On the water, the unsung hero of the American arsenal was the LCVP, the Higgins boat. Designed by Andrew Higgins, a Louisiana boat builder, this shallow draft vessel made of plywood could power right up to a beach, drop its steel ramp, and deliver 36 fully equipped infantrymen or a 3-ton truck directly into the fight. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the Supreme Allied Commander, later stated quite bluntly that without Higgins, the war could not have been won. The Allies were preparing to project power across a hostile body of water, on a scale not seen since General Ulysses S. Grant crossed the Mississippi River below Vicksburg in 1863, using mobility and misdirection to unhinge a fortified defender. Facing this American industrial tsunami was the German OB West, commanded by Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, an aristocratic Prussian traditionalist. Under him, commanding Army Group B and directly responsible for the defense of the Channel coast, was Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the famed Desert Fox. The German military machine in the West in 1944 was a schizophrenic beast. On one hand, you had elite panzer divisions equipped with the Panzer V Panther. The Panther was a 45-ton Apex Predator, armed with a high-velocity 75mm KWK 42 gun and sloped frontal armor that could deflect almost anything the Allies threw at it. On the other hand, the German infantry divisions guarding the beaches were often static units. These included the Ostlegionen, battalions made up of conscripted Soviet prisoners of war who had volunteered to fight for the Germans rather than starve in camps. Their combat motivation was, to put it mildly, questionable. Rommel arrived in France in late 1943, inspected the Atlantic Wall, and was absolutely appalled. He found the defences severely lacking. Rommel brought a frantic, obsessive energy to the coastal defences. He ordered the placement of over 50 million landmines along the French coast. He flooded river estuaries to drown paratroopers. He designed anti-glider obstacles consisting of massive wooden poles wired with artillery shells, grimly nicknamed Rommelspargel, or Rommel's asparagus. He reinforced concrete bunkers with steel rebar, creating interlocking fields of machine gun fire designed to turn the tidal flats into a meat grinder. But the fatal flaw in the German defense was a bitter doctrinal dispute between Rommel and von Rundstedt over how to deploy their armoured reserves. Von Rundstedt believed the Allies could not be stopped on the beaches. He wanted to hold the elite panzer divisions, specifically Panzer Group West, well inland near Paris. His plan was to let the Allies land, let them commit their forces, identify the main centre of gravity, and then launch a massive coordinated armoured counterattack to crush the beachhead. It was classic defence in depth. Rommel vehemently disagreed. Having fought the Americans and British in North Africa, Rommel understood something von Rundstedt did not. He understood the paralysing effect of total Allied air supremacy. Rommel knew that if the panzers were held 200 miles inland, the moment they moved out onto the French road network, American P-47 Thunderbolts and British Hawker Typhoons would tear them to pieces. Rommel argued that the panzers had to be stationed right on the coast, ready to counterattack within the first 24 hours. He famously stated that the first 24 hours of the invasion would be decisive, calling it the longest day. What happens when an unstoppable industrial juggernaut meets an immovable wall of reinforced concrete and a deeply divided enemy command structure? Hitler, in his infinite tactical wisdom, decided to split the difference. He gave Rommel 3 panzer divisions near the coast, but kept the bulk of the armoured reserve, 4 elite divisions, under his own personal command at OKW. They could not be moved without Hitler's explicit authorization. By trying to please both of his top generals, Hitler effectively guaranteed that neither got what they needed to win. This rigid, centralized command structure, combined with the German obsession that the attack must come at the Pas de Calais, gave the Allies a critical vulnerability to exploit. The Allies knew they could not hide the fact that an invasion was coming. You cannot hide 1.5 million men, thousands of ships, and mountains of supplies crammed into southern England. The island was literally sinking under the weight of American steel. So if you cannot hide the invasion, what do? You hide the location, and you hide the time. To do this, the Allies created the First United States Army Group, or FUSAG. This was a phantom army, a complete fabrication, existing mostly on paper, in radio transmissions, and in empty fields in Kent, directly across from the Pas de Calais. And to command this fake army, the Allies needed a commander the Germans feared and respected. They needed someone aggressive, loud, and historically proven in armoured warfare. They chose Lieutenant General George S. Patton. The Germans considered Patton the most dangerous Allied tank commander. The logic was simple in the minds of German intelligence. The Allies would naturally give their main invasion force to their best general. Therefore, wherever Patton is, the main effort must be. Patton's ego, currently bruised after he was sidelined for slapping 2 shell-shocked soldiers in Sicily, was weaponized. He was sent on high-profile tours of FUSAG facilities. But building a fake army requires more than just a famous general. It requires an unprecedented level of technical deception, a coordinated symphony of lies that would have to penetrate the highest echelons of German military intelligence, the Abwehr, and completely blind them to the real armada assembling just down the coast. The mechanics of this deception, the inflatable tanks, the fake radio traffic, and the double agents who sold the lie to Berlin, would dictate whether the men landing in Normandy would face a few static divisions or the full, concentrated wrath of the German panzer force. The mechanics of this phantom army relied on a masterpiece of American theatrical engineering, executed by the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, better known as the Ghost Army. We are talking about a highly classified unit of artists, sound engineers, and architects who treated the European theatre like a massive Hollywood soundstage. Their primary weapon was the inflatable M4 Sherman tank. Weighing a mere 93 pounds, this rubber and canvas decoy could be unloaded from a truck and fully inflated by a standard air compressor in just 20 minutes. From the air, a Luftwaffe reconnaissance pilot, snapping photographs at 10,000 feet, saw a perfectly aligned armoured division waiting for the order to move. On the ground, it was nothing but hot air. The Ghost Army even used bulldozers to carve fake tank tracks into the mud leading up to the inflatables, ensuring the visual illusion was flawless. But how do you sell a fake army when the enemy has sophisticated radio triangulation and listening posts scattered across the coast? You give them exactly what they are listening for. The Signal Corps operators assigned to the 1st United States Army Group transmitted thousands of fake radio messages. They studied the specific, sloppy Morse code signatures of actual American radio operators who had been transferred to real combat units, and perfectly mimicked their typing rhythm, known as a fist. German intelligence intercepted these signals, analyzed the fists, and confidently mapped out the locations of American divisions that did not exist. To complete the illusion, the Ghost Army deployed sonic deception. They used state-of-the-art wire recorders to capture the acoustic signatures of moving armored columns, infantry formations, and bridge-building operations. These recordings were played back through massive 500-watt amplifiers mounted on M3 half-tracks, projecting the terrifying rumble of non-existent tank treads up to 15 miles across the English Channel through the dense fog. It was the modern mechanized equivalent of General George Washington leaving campfires burning at Trenton to slip away from the British in 1777, but executed on a scale that altered the course of a world war. While the Americans handled the physical and electronic theatre, British intelligence executed the psychological kill shot through the double-cross system. MI5 had effectively captured or turned every single German spy operating in the United Kingdom. The crown jewel of this network was a Spanish double agent named Juan Pujol Garcia, codenamed Garbo. Operating out of London, Garbo fabricated a network of 27 fictitious sub-agents, feeding the German military intelligence, the Abwehr, a constant stream of highly detailed, meticulously crafted lies. Garbo sent hundreds of radio transmissions confirming exactly what the German High Command already believed. Normandy would merely be a diversionary attack, and the main hammer blow would fall on the Pas-de-Calais, led by General George S. Patton. The deception was so absolute, so flawlessly executed, that even after the Allies landed in Normandy, Hitler held his elite panzer divisions in reserve near Calais for weeks, waiting for Patton's phantom army that was never coming. With the Germans looking the wrong way, the true Allied invasion force faced an enemy far more unpredictable than the Wehrmacht, and that was the weather over the English Channel. The invasion window for early June 1944 was brutally narrow. The tactical checklist required a full moon to illuminate the drop zones for the airborne infantry, a low tide at dawn to expose Rommel's millions of underwater beach obstacles, and relatively calm seas to allow the flat-bottomed Higgins boats to navigate the surf. This specific celestial and meteorological alignment only occurred a few days each month. The original target date was June 5th. However, a massive low-pressure system rolled in from the Atlantic, bringing gale-force winds and 20-foot swells. What happens when you have 1.5 million heavily armed men loaded onto transport ships in a raging storm? You either launch the invasion and watch your fleet drown in the Channel, or you unload the ships, stand down the men, and lose the element of surprise forever. General Dwight D. Eisenhower was staring down the barrel of a logistical and strategic catastrophe. On the other side of the Channel, German meteorologists lacking weather stations in the North Atlantic assumed the severe storm would last for weeks. They deemed an Allied landing impossible. The German defensive posture relaxed, and Field Marshal Erwin Rommel actually left his headquarters in France to drive back to Germany for his wife's birthday. But the Allied chief meteorologist, Group Captain James Stagg, spotted a brief 24-hour break in the storm system approaching for the morning of June 6th. In a damp, smoke-filled room at Southwick House, Eisenhower absorbed the weather data, weighed the apocalyptic risks, and quietly spoke the words that unleashed hell. "Okay, let's go." The vanguard of Operation Overlord was not launched from the sea, but from the sky. Shortly before midnight on June 5th, over 13,000 American paratroopers of the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions loaded into hundreds of C-47 Skytrain transport planes. The tactical objective was to drop behind Utah Beach on the Cotentin Peninsula, secure the causeways leading off the sand, and prevent German armor from reinforcing the coastline. The C-47 was a reliable workhorse, flying at roughly 150 miles per hour, but it was completely unarmored. As the massive air armada crossed the French coastline and dropped to an altitude of 700 feet, they flew into a wall of German anti-aircraft fire. The flak was so intense that the tracer rounds lit up the inside of the aircraft cabins like daylight. Under heavy fire, inexperienced transport pilots panicked. They broke their tight V formations, took violent evasive action, and accelerated the aircraft to over 200 miles per hour to escape the kill zone. When the jumpmasters screamed for the paratroopers to exit the aircraft, the men stepped out the door into a slipstream that was moving far too fast. The prop wash was so violent that it ripped equipment bags right off the troopers' legs. These bags contained their heavy machine guns, mortars, radios, and medical supplies. Thousands of elite American paratroopers hit the ground, scattered across hundreds of square miles of flooded Normandy bocage, separated from their units, deep behind enemy lines, carrying nothing but a 30-pound M1 Garand rifle, a trench knife, and whatever ammunition they had stuffed into their jumpsuit pockets. The airborne assault devolved into a chaotic, decentralized series of vicious firefights in the dark, relying purely on the lethal initiative of small units and individual squad leaders to disrupt the German rear echelon. As dawn broke on June 6, the focus shifted to the water, and specifically to a 4-mile crescent of sand designated as Omaha Beach. If you want to understand the anatomy of a military nightmare, look at the topography of Omaha. The beach was backed by 100-foot-high bluffs, heavily fortified with concrete pillboxes, mortar pits, and interlocking fields of machine gun fire. The only exits off this kill zone were 5 narrow ravines, known as draws, cutting through the bluffs. The Germans knew this, and they zeroed every artillery piece and machine gun they had onto those natural choke points. The primary German infantry weapon dominating the bluffs was the Maschinengewehr 42, or MG-42. This was a belt-fed, recoil-operated machine gun that fired an astonishing 1,200 rounds per minute. It did not sound like a traditional gun. It sounded like canvas being ripped in half. The MG-42 was not just a weapon, it was the core of German infantry doctrine. It was a suppression tool designed to completely pin down an attacking force, allowing pre-sighted 88mm artillery to annihilate the paralyzed infantry. Facing this buzzsaw were young American farm boys and factory workers of the 1st and 29th Infantry Divisions, crammed into Higgins boats, violently seasick and weighed down by 80 pounds of waterlogged gear. To break the German defenses, the Americans relied on a highly classified piece of armored technology, the duplex drive, or DD Sherman tank. The DD tank was a standard 33-ton Sherman fitted with a massive canvas flotation skirt and 2 rear propellers designed to swim off a landing craft and provide immediate armored fire support on the beach. It was an engineering marvel on paper, designed to operate in waves no higher than 1 foot. The waves in the channel on the morning of June 6th were cresting at 6 feet. When the 741st Tank Battalion launched their DD Shermans 3 miles off the coast of Omaha Beach, the results were catastrophic. The heavy swells crashed over the canvas skirts, instantly swamping the vehicles. Out of 32 swimming tanks launched by the battalion, 27 sank straight to the bottom of the English Channel, taking their crews down into the freezing dark. The American infantry hit the sand at 06:30 hours, with almost no armoured support, stepping off the ramps of their landing craft directly into a hurricane of German lead. The closest American precedent to the meat grinder at Omaha Beach was the Union assault on Marie's Heights at the Battle of Fredericksburg in 1862, where infantry was ordered to march across open ground into concentrated, overlapping fields of entrenched enemy fire. Within the first hour on Omaha, the leading assault companies suffered up to 50% casualties. Men drowned in the surf, pulled under by their heavy equipment. German artillery shells turned the wooden Higgins boats into splintered coffins before the ramps even dropped. The beach became a chaotic, smoking graveyard of burning vehicles and shattered bodies, completely pinned down behind a small shingle bank, unable to advance, and with the tide rapidly coming in behind them. The beach was choked with burning steel and bleeding men. The meticulous invasion timetable was in absolute ruins, and the German defenders on the bluffs were preparing the final counter-barrage to push the Americans back into the sea. How does a shattered, leaderless assault force, pinned down on a strip of sand with no armor and no retreat, suddenly break the back of the Atlantic Wall? The answer does not lie in a grand strategic directive from a general sitting in a comfortable headquarters in London. It lies in the brutal, decentralized reality of American infantry doctrine and the desperate intervention of the United States Navy. When the meticulous invasion timetable disintegrated into bloody chaos on the sands of Omaha Beach, the rigid, top-down command structure of the German military expected the American assault to simply stall and die. Instead, the survival of the beachhead fell on the shoulders of junior officers, non-commissioned officers, and individual privates who realized that staying on the beach meant certain death. Brigadier General Norman Cotter, the assistant commander of the 29th Infantry Division, famously walked upright through heavy machine gun fire on the shingle, cigar in his mouth, and delivered one of the most grimly pragmatic orders in military history, stating that there were only two kinds of people on that beach: the dead and those who were going to die. So they might as well get the hell out of there and move inland. But infantry cannot bite through reinforced concrete with M1 Garand rifles. The tactical deadlock was broken by an act of spectacular naval insubordination. Seeing the slaughter unfolding on the beaches, the commanders of American destroyers, including the USS Carmick, the USS McCook, and the USS Frankfurt, blatantly ignored their standing orders to stay in deep water. They ordered their helmsmen to steam directly toward the shore, navigating treacherous shoals and submerged mines until their keels were literally scraping the sandy bottom of the English Channel. Sitting less than 1,000 yards from the shoreline, these destroyers turned their 5-inch 38 caliber naval guns into direct-fire sniper rifles. They engaged in point-blank duels with German 88mm anti-tank guns hidden in the pillboxes. The concussive blast of high-explosive naval shells shattered the concrete casemates, blowing the German gun crews to pieces, and finally punching holes in the defensive line. This desperate collaboration between stranded infantry and aggressive naval gunfire mirrors the critical turning point at the Battle of Gettysburg in 1863. During Pickett's charge, the Confederate infantry was annihilated because they marched into overlapping fields of artillery and rifle fire without sufficient suppressive support. At Omaha, the Americans were seconds away from suffering a mechanized version of Pickett's charge, until the destroyers provided the heavy suppression that the swamped D.D. Sherman tanks could not. By mid-afternoon, small ad hoc bands of American infantry had infiltrated up the draws, bypassed the heaviest strongpoints, and begun clearing the trench lines from the rear with Thompson submachine guns, fragmentation grenades, and flamethrowers. The Atlantic Wall, billed by Nazi propaganda as an impenetrable fortress, was fundamentally flawed because it was merely a tripwire. Once breached, it had no depth, and the German defenders, lacking the mobile armoured reserves that Rommel had begged for, were completely outflanked. However, breaking the crust of the coastline was only the first phase of the logistical nightmare. How do you sustain a mechanized army of hundreds of thousands of men, requiring millions of gallons of fuel and thousands of tons of ammunition every single day, when the enemy holds every major deep-water port in Europe? The Allied solution was a marvel of industrial engineering that completely circumvented traditional military logic. If they could not capture a port, they would build their own and tow them across the ocean. These were the Mulberry Harbors. Constructed in absolute secrecy in Britain, the Mulberries were artificial seaports comprised of massive hollow concrete caissons known as phoenixes, some weighing up to 6,000 tons each. Following the assault waves, a fleet of tugboats dragged these concrete leviathans across the channel and intentionally sank them off the coast of Arromanches and Omaha Beach to create massive breakwaters. Inside these artificial lagoons, engineers assembled miles of floating steel piers, codenamed whales, which rose and fell with the 20-foot Norman tides. This allowed deep-draft Liberty ships to unload heavy cargo directly onto trucks, which then drove over the floating roadways onto the beach. To find a historical equivalent to this level of logistical audacity, we have to look back to the American Civil War, specifically to General Ulysses S. Grant's siege of Petersburg in 1864. Grant knew he could not defeat Robert E. Lee in a war of maneuver, so he built a sprawling, industrialized logistical hub out of thin air at City Point, Virginia. Grant's engineers constructed wharves, warehouses, and a military railroad system that fed a relentless stream of supplies to the Union Army, effectively burying the Confederacy under a mountain of northern industrial output. The Mulberry Harbors were City Point on a global scale. By the end of June, the artificial port at Omaha alone was handling over 10,000 tons of vehicles and supplies per day. But vehicles require fuel, and moving fuel by ship is slow and vulnerable to German U-boats. The economic and logistical masterstroke of Overlord was Pluto, the pipeline under the ocean. British and American engineers developed massive, flexible steel pipes that were unspooled from giant floating drums, called conundrums, directly across the floor of the English Channel. These underwater pipelines connected the oil refineries of England directly to the French coast, pumping hundreds of thousands of gallons of 80-octane aviation fuel and diesel fuel every single day. The German High Command, trapped in a traditional mindset, simply could not comprehend an enemy capable of laying an underwater oil pipeline in the middle of a war zone. While the Allied logistical juggernaut was establishing itself on the beaches, the intelligence war continued to pay massive dividends. Operation Fortitude, the deception plan involving General George S. Patton's fake Ghost Army, did not end on June 6th. In fact, it became even more critical. The Allies had to convince Hitler that the Normandy landings were merely a diversion, a trap designed to draw German reserves away from the real target at the Pas de Calais. Through the double-agent Garbo and continued fake radio traffic, the British intelligence services fed the German Abwehr a narrative that perfectly matched Hitler's own paranoid confirmation bias. Why did an entire German army group sit idle while the Third Reich collapsed in Normandy? It was a catastrophic failure of military intelligence, compounded by dictatorial micromanagement. Hitler was so terrified of Patton and so convinced by the phantom radio signals that he kept the German 15th Army, comprising hundreds of thousands of combat-ready troops and elite panzer divisions, locked in position around Calais for 7 crucial weeks after D-Day. If those 15 divisions had been released and ordered to march south on June 10th, the sheer weight of German armor would have likely crushed the fragile Allied beachheads and thrown Eisenhower's armies back into the sea. The deception was so effective that it essentially neutralized an entire German army without firing a single shot. As the Americans pushed inland from the beaches, they encountered an environmental and tactical nightmare that no intelligence officer had adequately prepared them for: the Norman bocage. The hedgerows of Normandy were not the manicured garden bushes of suburban America. They were massive earthen embankments, often 5 feet thick and 10 feet high, heavily reinforced by centuries of intertwined oak and bramble roots. Every single farm field became a natural, impenetrable fortress. The German defenders, masters of tactical adaptation, turned the bocage into a killing ground. They dug their Panther and Panzer IV tanks into the sunken roads between the hedgerows, making them virtually invisible from the air and invulnerable to frontal assault. An American Sherman tank attempting to climb over a hedgerow would expose its unarmored underbelly to hidden German anti-tank guns, resulting in immediate destruction. The American advance ground to a bloody, agonizing halt, measuring progress not in miles, but in yards and blood. The solution to the hedgerow hell did not come from a defense contractor or a general, but from a 29-year-old cavalry sergeant named Curtis G. Cullen. Applying the same raw initiative seen on Omaha Beach, Cullen realized that the thousands of steel, spider-like anti-landing obstacles the Germans had planted on the beaches, known as Czech hedgehogs, were made of high-quality steel. He ordered his maintenance crews to cut up these steel beams and weld them to the front glacis plates of the Sherman tanks, creating a massive set of steel prongs. This field modification, known as the rhinoceros tank, allowed the Shermans to violently ram their way through the earthen banks rather than climbing over them, keeping their armor facing forward and their guns level. It was a brilliant, improvised recycling of the enemy's own defenses. Within weeks, the American industrial maintenance battalions had welded Cullen's cutters onto hundreds of tanks, completely restoring mobility to the armored divisions and shattering the German defensive doctrine in the bocage. The culmination of the Normandy campaign was the total encirclement and annihilation of the German Army Group B at the Falaise Pocket in August 1944. General Patton, now commanding the very real and highly lethal American Third Army, broke out of the bocage and executed a sweeping armored right hook, driving deep into the German rear. Simultaneously, the British and Canadian forces pushed down from the north. The German army, exhausted, starved of fuel, and pounded relentlessly by Allied tactical air power, was trapped in a shrinking perimeter. This operational envelopment is a direct reflection of General George Washington's masterful trap at the Siege of Yorktown in 1781. Washington utilized a complex deception plan to convince the British command in New York that he was preparing a massive siege of the city, while secretly marching his Continental Army and French allies hundreds of miles south to trap Lord Cornwallis against the sea. In both Yorktown and Falaise, the enemy was paralyzed by a phantom threat, outmaneuvered by superior logistics, and ultimately crushed in a pocket from which there was no escape. The German military machine in France was broken, losing over 400,000 men, thousands of tanks, and effectively ending Nazi control of Western Europe. Operation Overlord remains the supreme masterclass in combined arms warfare, industrial logistics, and psychological deception. It proved that in modern mechanized conflict, the side that can seamlessly integrate the factory floor, the intelligence apparatus, and the bleeding edge of the infantry squad will inevitably crush a rigid, dogmatic opponent. The Atlantic Wall was a monument to static arrogance, shattered by the relentless flexibility of the Allied war machine. War is, at its core, a ruthless ledger of blood, steel, and deception, where the greatest victories are often won before the first shot is ever fired, by convincing your enemy to defeat himself. Which factor do you believe was the most critical to the success of the Normandy invasion? A. The Ghost Army and the Fortitude deception plan. B. The overwhelming industrial logistics of the Mulberry Harbors and Pluto. C. The raw tactical initiative of the junior officers and infantry on the beaches. Let us know your analysis in the comments below.